Good evening, everybody. We're now going to have a talk by Barbara Partee on Abralin ao Vivo. And I must start by saying that this initiative, Abralin ao Vivo, is sponsored by Abralin and organized beautifully by Abralin, but also it's an event that is done in cooperation with the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistes, ALFAL, Associação de Linguística e Filología de América Latina, SAEL, Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, LSA, the Linguistic Society of America, and LAGB, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain. So quite a lot of people are involved in supporting this event. It's a great event. So I am now so very happy and so proud and honored to introduce the founding mother of formal semantics, Barbara Partee. And I'll start by the academic properties that she has. Barbara is a distinguished university professor at emerita of linguistics and philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. As I mentioned before, she is the founding mother of formal semantics. It's not a small thing. Her research centers on formal semantics, and she's the author, I must say, of a number of influential works on subjects such as anaphora, coreference, tense, the verb, the copula, the verb to be, type shifting, compositionality, quantifiers, and genitives lately. Her papers had quite an impact in the area, I can say that. And now she's writing a book on the history of formal semantics. So we having a talk fresh from her book, I suppose. So she has been 7 years a lecturer at UCLA, and then she was a lecturer at University of Massachusetts for more than 40 years. I met her there in the around 2000, which was great. Besides this, this wonderful human being introduced formal semantics to Russia, like by teaching there for around 20 years. She would go back and forth from the States to Moscow, and but that's not by chance. It's also that she has a Russian husband, I must say. So she and her husband would go back and forth and would work with, she would co-work with him and other Russian colleagues on Slavic semantics. It's impressive. Oh, and in addition to all these academic realizations, I must say that she's a brilliant person. Oh, you should know that because of all the things she did. But things you don't know is that she is, she is a very generous and welcoming human being. When I was there, she would worry if I had, a place to spend Thanksgiving. And she would also, little things like that, or whether I was participating on the semantics lectures, the semantics reading groups. And besides doing all the academic work of discussing my papers and everything, so I'm very, very grateful to her. But I think it's not only me, I think many people are. And besides, I'm just finishing this introduction by saying that I think that all these qualities as an academic and as a person is that made it possible for her to be the founding mother of formal semantics. But she's a person that likes to bring people together. So she brought together generative linguistics and philosophy of language and logicians and founded this new area, which has had an amazing impact in linguistics. And up to now, I think, and it will keep on doing that. So thank you so much, Barbara, for being with us. Okay, so it's your turn now.
Okay. Okay. So now I can turn on my screen share, right? Yeah. Let's see. This one. Okay. All right. So here we go. So thank you so much, Anna. That I almost can't talk now because your introduction makes me cry. But so wait a minute. Why are my slides not moving? There we go. So let me just start by giving my greetings to Brazil. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk in this wonderful series. My husband, Vladimir Barshov, and I have wonderful memories of our trip to Brazil. That was in August 2001. Anna Müller, who you just heard introducing me, as she said, she spent a postdoc year here at UMass in 2000, and then invited us to the University of Sao Paulo for a lecture series and a great one-week sort of school thing, along with Luigi Rizzi and Adriana Belletti and Georges Nivat, maybe there were others. And then in between those two events, we had a wonderful and memorable ecotourism trip to the Pantanal. And another nice connection with Brazil, Ubirata Alves lived with us for a semester in 2007 when he was a postdoc here. And most recently, Suzy Lima, who got her first 2 degrees at the University of Sao Paulo, came to UMass and did her PhD here in 2014, combining psycholinguistics and semantics with Lynn Fraser and Angelica Kratzer. And she's been doing groundbreaking work on semantic typology and acquisition. So greetings to all our friends in and from Brazil. And as I've been telling my friends that I'm giving a talk in Brazil today, I should say greetings to all my friends from Brazil. Okay, so wait, how do I, why doesn't this turn, okay. All right, so now the real introduction. Formal semantics and formal pragmatics, as they've developed over the last 50 years, have been shaped by fruitful interdisciplinary collaboration among linguists, philosophers, and logicians, among others, affecting and affected by developments in linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and computational linguistics. There have been centuries of study of logic and of language, and until the late 19th century, the disciplines of logic, psychology, and linguistics were not yet separated, and issues of logic, thought, and language were often discussed together and closely intertwined. I'm writing a book, as Anna said, on the history of formal semantics. In this talk, I'll reflect on the growth of formal semantics in linguistics and philosophy starting in the 60s. I'll touch in passing on innovations and big ideas that have shaped its development as it became a branch of linguistics, and draw connections with foundational issues in linguistic theory, philosophy, and cognitive science. Semantics traditionally meant quite different things to linguists, philosophers, and psychologists, since different fields have different central concerns and different methodologies. Philosophers have long been concerned with truth and reference, with logic, with compositionality, with how meaning is connected with thought, and with the analysis of philosophically important terms. Linguists, influenced by Chomsky, care about what is in the head of a speaker of a language and how it's acquired. Psychologists have long experimentally studied concept discrimination, concept acquisition, emphasis mostly on the lexical level. Syntax has influenced linguists' notions of what you might call logical form. When you talk about structure of meaning to a linguist, that suggests some kind of tree diagrams or something from our syntactic background. Logicians build formal systems, axioms, model theoretic interpretation. Structure to a logician suggests inferential patterns or algebraic structures. Wait a minute. Here we are. What did something? I don't. There. Okay. The principal sources of formal semantics. So formal semantics has roots in several disciplines, most importantly, logic, philosophy, and linguistics. The most important figures in its history were Richard Montague, who lived a tragically short life and whose seminal works date from the late 1960s and the beginning of the 70s, and David Lewis, whose major contributions span the 1970s. There were many other important contributors. None will get their fair treatment today because the story is too big and time is too short. But let's back up to some prehistory. So first looking at semantics and linguistics. So prehistory for me is like before syntactic structures. In the 19th century, linguistics existed within philology in Europe and in large part within anthropology in the United States. Detailed descriptive lexical semantics was important for philology, and semantic fields like kinship terms were important for anthropology, but those kinds of interest in semantics were not really ingredients in the growth of what became formal semantics. In the 20th century, like so many other fields, linguistics emerged as a science. Part of the Chomskyan revolution was to view linguistics as a branch of psychology. His revolutionary work was one of the important ingredients in the growth of cognitive science. There were negative attitudes to semantics in American linguistics in the 20th century for several reasons. Partly, it was the influence of logical positivism and behaviorism in psychology. Neglect of semantics in early American linguistics was also because of the fieldwork tradition, where by necessity you start with phonetics, then you can do phonology, then morphology. Occasionally you get to a little syntax, and there's hardly any semantics except for word lists and dictionaries. On the other hand, in logic and philosophy of semantics, there was great progress in semantics in the 20th century, but that was relatively unknown to most linguists. And my screen just disappeared. Come back. Okay. I'll get better at this as we progress. In 1954, the philosopher Yehoshua Bar Hillel wrote an article in the linguistics journal Language, inviting cooperation between linguists and logicians, arguing that advances in both fields would seem to make the time ripe for an attempt to combine forces to work on syntax and semantics together. He was arguing against logicians who considered natural language too unruly to formalize, and he was appealing to linguists to make use of some of the logicians' methods. He was friends with Chomsky, he was friends with Montague, he appreciated what both of them were doing, and he saw that those advances ought to be able to be combined, not just Montague, but more generally. But in 1955, Chomsky, who was then a PhD student, wrote a reply in Language, arguing that the artificial languages invented by logicians were so unlike natural languages that the methods that logicians had developed for studying the semantics of their languages had no chance of being any use for linguistic theory. Chomsky and Bar Hillel remained good friends. That was just an argument. Bar Hillel didn't give up, though. In 1967, he wrote to Montague after receipt of one of Montague's papers. And he wrote, your paper will doubtless be a considerable contribution to the field, though I remain perfectly convinced that without taking into account the recent achievements in theoretical linguistics, your contribution will remain one-sided. Also in 1967, during the Third International Congress for Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science, Bar Hillel organized a symposium in Amsterdam on the role of formal logic in the evaluation of argumentation in natural languages. And he got together quite a range of people: Jerry Katz, Montague, Jaco Hintica, Max Black, Fritz Stahl, Stenius, Lyons, Dummett, and others. That was the first time Katz from the Chomskyan side and Montague had any direct interaction. But back to our history. Chomsky concentrated on the native speaker's ability to produce and understand a potentially infinite class of sentences. His conclusion was that linguistic competence must involve some finite description of an infinite class of sentences. His formulation of the goals of linguistic theory to understand the nature of linguistic competence revolutionized the field. Chomsky was and has been ambivalent about semantics. He's been skeptical about the possibility of including semantics in a formal grammar, and he has certainly insisted on the autonomy of syntax. That is, he was most strongly opposed to using semantics to ground syntax in any way. But he has held that one test of a syntactic theory is that it should provide a basis for a good semantics. As he would say, if only we had any idea how to study semantics. Katz and Fodor in the early 60s added a semantic component to generative grammar. They were the first to do that. They addressed what they called the projection problem, i.e. compositionality, how to get the meaning of a sentence from the meanings of its parts. At that time, negation and question formation were transformations of simple positive declarative sentences. Those were prime examples of meaning changing transformations. So meaning depended not just on the kernel sentences, but on the entire transformational history. So Chomsky's P markers, the phrase structure trees for kernel sentences, were extended by them to what they called T markers, to which the semantic projection rules applied. That is, the meaning could depend on the phrase markers of the simple kernel sentences that went into building up a sentence, plus the whole transformational history of the derivation. Katz and Fodor's idea of computing the meaning on the basis of the whole T marker can be seen as aiming in the same direction as Montague's later derivation trees and Haskell Curry's tectogrammatical structure. So here's for instance, a very tiny sketch of a T marker for the sentence, "The airplanes will not fly." It includes a P marker. I've just drawn brackets, but you should imagine a whole little phrase structure tree. The P marker for its deep structure, which is the same as the deep structure for "the airplanes will fly," plus a graph showing what transformations have been applied in its derivation. And in this case, the important one is that the negation transformation applied. So that the meaning is computed on the basis of the meaning of that simple sentence and what negation does to it. There's Katz on the left and Jerry Fodor on the right. But their semantics was very primitive. Katz and Fodor worked with semantic features, and their semantic representations were bundles of features, suitable at best for decompositions of one-place predicates. Quine, in his book, Philosophy of Logic, wrote the nice sentence, "Logic chases truth up the tree of grammar." Katz and Fodor's position might be characterized as semantic projection rules chase semantic features up the tree of grammar. What they were trying to capture had nothing to do with truth conditions, but rather properties like ambiguity, synonymy, anomaly, analyticity, characterized in terms of such things as how many readings a certain sentence has, or whether two sentences share a reading, etc. Philosophers reacted to Katz and Fodor's idea of what sorts of things a semantic representation might be. David Lewis coined the term marqueries for Katz and Fodor's representations in terms of semantic features and semantic markers. David Lewis wrote in his paper, General Semantics, "But we can know the marqueries translation of an English sentence without knowing the first thing about the meaning of the English sentence, namely the conditions under which it would be true. Semantics with no treatment of truth conditions is not semantics." And then again he wrote, "Translation into marqueries is at best a substitute for real semantics, relying either on our tacit competence at some future date as speakers of Marquarese, or on our ability to do real semantics, at least for the one language Marquarese. But linguists did presuppose tacit competence in Marquarese. They took that or some kind of representation language to be universal and innate, and many still do. To philosophers and logicians doing formal semantics, the language of Marquarese looked empty, since in their sense it was an uninterpreted language. It was just strings of symbols. To linguists in 1970, concern with truth looked puzzling. Linguists were trying to figure out mental representations that would underlie linguistic competence. Actual truth was correctly considered irrelevant, and the notion of truth conditions were not really understood. When the linguistic relevance of truth conditions finally penetrated quite a bit later, the very nature of linguistic semantics changed, not just in terms of the tools used, but also in the questions asked and the criteria of adequacy demanded for semantic analyses. But still, with the linguists, in a theoretically important move, which is completely separable from the Marquarese issue and related to the problem of compositionality, Jerry Katz and Paul Postal in 1964 made the innovation of putting morphemes like negation and a question morpheme Q into deep structure, as in the examples in 4 here. So these were the things that had made negation and question formation a meaning changing transformations. So in 4, you see the underlying structure for Mary has not visited Moscow is a structure that has negation already in it. So the T-neg transformation on that view just tells you where you put negation to get a proper surface structure. And similarly for the question, the deep structure has Mary visited Moscow has a question morpheme in it. And the question transformation just tells you how to turn that into a question in English. So then with that change, meaning could be determined on the basis of deep structure alone. This led to a really beautiful architecture, which Chomsky laid out in his 1965 book, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. We have base rules that generate deep structures as big phrase structures, and that's the input to the semantic component. Then transformational rules map deep structures onto surface structures, and the surface structures are the input to the phonological component. In the end, this didn't work, and that's not the prevailing view now, but it definitely was beautiful and clean and explanatory, if only it had worked. This big change in architecture rested on Katz and Postal's interesting and provocative claim that transformations are always meaning preserving, a claim which led to interesting debates, even without any, quote, real semantics at the foundation. And Chomsky, in aspects, added to the elegance of the architecture by combining all the underlying kernel sentences that went into a multi-clause sentence into one big deep structure. During the brief period when aspects held sway, there was a rosy optimism that the form of syntactic theory was more or less understood, and we could start trying to figure out the substantive universals. This is when I was a graduate student. I got my PhD in 1965, and we went out into the world thinking, now we understand the structure of syntactic theory. Now we go out and figure out how all different languages work and what's universal and what's language particular. And it was a very heady and rosily optimistic time. And the idea that meaning was determined at this deep level, and Chomsky's clever use of the word deep for that level, was undoubtedly part of the appeal of the notion of deep structure beyond linguistics. Just look at Leonard Bernstein's Norton Lectures, The Unanswered Question, where he talks about deep structure and surface structure in music. And that same idea was probably contributed to the aura surrounding the notion of language as a window on the mind. We get at the deep structures, we're getting at something deep. What upset that lovely view? Linguists discovered quantifiers. I'm oversimplifying a little, but really that's a good way to look in a nutshell at what happened. Transformations that preserved meaning more or less when applied to names, and all the examples in the early work had names for the noun phrases, clearly did not preserve meaning when applied to some quantifiers. Take, for instance, the classic transformation that was called equi-noun phrase deletion. John wants John to win would be the deep structure that gets mapped into John wants to win by deleting the John from the embedded clause. But if you do that with a deep structure that has everyone wants everyone to win, you would get everyone wants to win. It's a grammatical sentence, but it doesn't seem like if the deep structure should determine the semantics, that shouldn't be the deep structure for everyone wants to win. Similar problems for every, sorry, there's a typo, but every candidate voted for himself, and every number is even or odd. They came from every candidate voted for every candidate. That gets the wrong semantics. Every number is even or every number is odd. That doesn't get the right semantics for that sentence. So these problems are what led to the linguistic wars between generative and interpretive semantics. In a nutshell, oversimplifying terribly, generative semanticists put logical form first. They wanted semantically interpretable deepest structures. They wanted to keep the idea that the deep structure determines meaning and just make it deeper so that it would. Whereas the interpretive semanticists put linguistic form first, insisting on an autonomous syntax, independently motivated syntactic structures. Okay, so now we have the battles of the late 60s and early 70s raging in linguistics. Let's back up and turn to background in philosophy and logic. The relevant history in philosophy goes back at least to Aristotle. But for today, all I'll say about Aristotle was that his logic was so elegant that his syllogistic treatment of quantifier sentences became like a Bible for centuries. And all of his examples had just one quantifier per sentence. That left sentences with more than one quantifier totally ignored until the 19th century. So how beautiful his work was may have held things back a little. The history of the formally oriented approach towards the philosophy of language goes back at least to Descartes and Leibniz. Descartes, like the medieval speculative grammarians, believed that underlying all speech, there exists a lingua universalis. But what it represented was the form of human reason and not the nature of things in the world. And Leibniz developed Descartes' idea further, calling the general framework for such a universal language a characteristica universalis, based on an ars combinatoria, a system of symbolization that would have simple forms for simple concepts, and an unambiguous logical forms displaying the logical structure of all complex expressions. Together, these should provide a logical analysis of all the actual and possible concepts that might arise in science. And the framework was to include a calculus ratiocinator, a complete system of deduction that would allow new knowledge to be derived from old. In the 19th century, George Boole had an algebraic conception for a system governing the laws of thought, a calculus ratiocinator, independent from the vagaries of natural language. Boolean algebra turns out to have widespread application to natural language semantics, whether Boole would like that or not. But the greatest foundational figure for formal semantics is Gottlob Frege. His crucial ideas include the idea that function argument structure is the key to semantic compositionality. Frege is also credited with the principle of compositionality. The meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of its parts and of the way they are syntactically combined. And Frege introduced the important distinction between sense and reference, Sinn and Bedeutung, which philosophers and semanticists have been trying to formalize adequately ever since. Something like intension and extension, but not exactly. One of Frege's great contributions was the logical structure of quantified sentences, including sentences with more than one quantifier. That was part of the design of a concept script or Begriffsschrift, a logically perfect language to satisfy Leibniz's goals. Frege didn't see himself as offering an analysis of natural language, but a tool to augment it as the microscope augments the eye. He appreciated natural language for its power and its great resources, but believed that we might need something more delicate to accomplish certain kinds of purposes like exact argumentation. Frege also figured out a systematic and compositional semantics for variable binding, prefiguring something that Tarski did 50 years later. And on a very interesting debate of the time, Frege rejected the psychologism of many of his predecessors, including John Stuart Mill. Mill argued that logic is a branch of psychology. Mill said, so far as it is a science at all, logic is a part or branch of psychology, differing from it, on the one hand, as the part differs from the whole, and on the other, as an art differs from a science. Its theoretical grounds are wholly borrowed from psychology and include as much of that science as is required to justify its rules of art. You can see here that logic is being thought of as how we reason and rules of avoiding fallacies and that kind of thing. So logic in that view was an art. One of Frege's main theses is that mathematics and logic are not part of psychology, and that the objects and laws of mathematics and philosophy are not defined, illuminated, proven true, or explained by psychological observations and results. One of Frege's central arguments for this thesis is the consideration that whereas mathematics is the most exact of all sciences, psychology is imprecise and vague. Frege straightens this out by saying, in the realm of logic, we find both descriptive and prescriptive laws, with the former, the descriptive ones, being the foundation for the prescriptive ones. Every law that states what is can be apprehended as prescribing that one ought to think in accordance with it. This holds of geometrical and physical laws no less than logical laws. Frege's main criticism of the psychological view of logic is that it conflates true, which is what true logic is concerned with, and being taken to be true, which is a psychological state. So here's some key 20th century developments in logic and semantics. Bertrand Russell, who did a lot of important work, introduced logical types to avoid the paradox that he found in set theory, and used them to impose restrictions on well-formed function argument expressions. Early Carnap used the theory of types syntactically for what he called the logical construction of the world and the logical construction of language. Later, Carnap came to appreciate semantic ideas after he was acquainted with Tarski, and developed a semantic approach where meaning equals truth conditions, an idea he got from early Wittgenstein. Carnap introduced possible worlds as state descriptions and analyzed intensions as functions from possible worlds to extensions. Tarski developed model theory based in set theory, and with it made major advances in providing a semantics for logical languages in many ways, in many cases for the first time, including his semantical definition of truth. So here's Rudolf Carnap and Alfred Tarski. They both had major influence on Montagu's work. In the 1950s, so it wasn't only the linguists who had wars. In the 1950s, a war began within philosophy of language, the ordinary language versus formal language war. Ordinary language philosophers rejected the formal approach and urged attention to ordinary language and its uses. I should note that the logics and the way that Russell and others were formalizing it had no context dependence. It was very abstract kinds of sentences. So ordinary language philosophers included late Wittgenstein and Strawson, Austin, Ryle. Strawson in On Referring, which was a reaction to Russell's On Denoting, writing about definite descriptions like the king, wrote, "The actual unique reference made, if any, is a matter of the particular use in the particular context. Neither Aristotelian nor Russellian rules give the exact logic of any expression of ordinary language, for ordinary language has no exact logic." Russell, in a reply called Mr. Strawson on Referring, says, "I may say, to begin with, that I am totally unable to see any validity whatever in any of Mr. Strawson's arguments." But then toward the end of the article, he writes, "I agree, however, with Mr. Strawson's statement that ordinary language has no logic." So actually both sides in this war, like Chomsky later, were in agreement that logical methods of formal language analysis do not apply to natural languages. Russell, like other formal language theorists of his time, were trying to invent languages that could be used for exact reasoning to replace the not so good natural language that we were stuck with otherwise. Terry Parsons, he's my age, my generation, he reports that when he started thinking about natural language in the late 60s, he was very much aware of the tradition from Russell that the grammar of natural language is a bad guide to doing semantics. But in On Denoting, he realized Russell had actually produced an algorithm for going from this bad syntax to a good semantics. And that would suggest, Terry reasoned, that natural language does not have such a bad syntax for expressing meaning, including the meaning of sentences with quantifiers, definite descriptions, and the other thing that Russell cared about and thought that he had to invent a better formal language to express. Formalists like Russell generally advocated replacing natural language with a formal logical language for purposes of exact reasoning, just as physicists use mathematical formulas and not ordinary language. The interesting response of some formally oriented philosophers to the debates was to try to analyze ordinary language better, including its context-dependent features, which hadn't been treated earlier. The generation that included Pryor, Bar-Hillel, Reichenbach, Curry, and Montague gradually became more and more optimistic about being able to formalize the crucial aspects of natural language. Arthur Pryor made great progress on the analysis of tense, which is one central source of context dependence in natural languages, which had been omitted from earlier logical languages. Now we get to Montague's work. Montague was a student of Tarski's, and he was an important contributor to these developments. His higher order typed intentional logic unified tense logic and modal logic, extending Pryor's work, and more generally unified formal pragmatics with intentional logic, with ways of taking contexts and context-dependent expressions into account. Montague also generalized the intentional notions of property, proposition, individual concept, etc., into a fully typed intentional logic, extending work of Carnap, Church, and Kaplan, putting together Frege's function argument structure with the treatment of intensions as functions to extensions. What made his approach daunting, it's hard work when you try to read his papers unassisted. What made it daunting also made it powerful. The rich type structure made it possible to have semantic types, not just for sentences, predicates, and terms, which is all you have in first order logic, but for determiners and determiner phrases or noun phrases, modifiers, degree phrases, many other types of expressions. That made it much easier to work compositionally with an independently motivated syntax. I should inject at this point that the generative semanticists, when they were trying to give deeper structures that would represent the meanings of sentences, the only logic they had to work with was first order logic plus a few modal operators. And that forced them to decompose sentences into structures that didn't look very much like natural language syntactic structures at all. So this was one of the big things that having a type theory to work with made possible, and part of what made Montagu's work attractive to linguists like me when we discovered it. Why did Montagu turn to work on natural language? It's kind of surprising because he was Tarski's student, and what was valued in the Tarski world was proving difficult theorems. A clue about Montagu's motivations I finally found when I was looking through the Montagu archives in the UCLA library. This was a handwritten page that was attached to a handout of an early talk version of his paper, English as a Formal Language. So this was obviously what he was going to say in introducing the talk. I had to decipher his shorthand, but by now I'm sure I've got this right. Okay. So what he said to them before he started with the handout. This talk is the result of two annoyances. One is the distinction some philosophers, especially in England, draw between formal and informal languages. And the other is the great sound and fury that nowadays issues from MIT under the label of mathematical linguistics or the new grammar, a clamor not to the best of my knowledge accompanied by any accomplishments. I therefore sat down one day and proceeded to do something that I previously regarded and continue to regard as both rather easy and not very important. That is, to analyze ordinary language. I shall, of course, present only a small fragment of English, but I think a rather revealing one. He inserted a note, there is other creditable work like traditional grammar and Eidrukevich, Bonert and Backer and Hans Kamp. Later notes in the archives from his work on this project in 1970 suggest that he did eventually find it not entirely easy. You can imagine the shock I had when I found that piece of paper. From Stahl's edited proceedings of Bar Hillel's symposium, we get a taste of his own view of his linguistic work. So he said, as far as the main points are concerned, let me say first that I deplore the distinction customarily drawn between formal and informal languages. The syntax and semantics of certain not insignificant fragments of English can be treated just as formally and precisely as those of the first order predicate calculus, and in very much the same manner. Yet, although I have myself devoted some time to this goal, I somewhat question its importance. Is it really so important to be able to establish conclusively that a given argument in a natural language is invalid? I believe that as the scope of exact artificial languages is enlarged, people will begin to use them for argumentation. Witness the gradual abandonment of ordinary language by mathematicians between 1875 and the present. So Montagu, we think, might not be happy that he's best known for his contributions to work on natural language, because I don't think he thought it was his most important work, but some of us do. Montagu's first work on natural language was the provocatively titled English as a Formal Language, or EFL. He had taught the material at UCLA in spring '65 when Hans Kamp was his student there, and at the University of Amsterdam in spring '66. It famously begins, I reject the contention that an important theoretical difference exists between formal and natural languages. As noted by Bach, the term theoretical here must be understood from a logician's perspective and not from a linguist's. What Montagu was denying was the central presupposition of the formal language, ordinary language wars, namely the presupposition that there's a mismatch between linguistic form and logical form for natural languages. And what he was proposing here and in his universal grammar paper was a framework for describing syntax and semantics and the relation between them that he considered compatible with existing practice for formal languages and an improvement on existing practice for the description of natural language. The Fregean principle of compositionality was central to his theory and remained central in formal semantics. His syntax-semantics interface was that syntax is expressed as an algebra, semantics is an algebra, and compositionality is the requirement that there be a homomorphism mapping the former onto the latter. The nature of the elements of the syntactic and semantic algebras is left open. You can have many different theories of syntax and semantics put into algebraic form. What's constrained is the relation between them. The differences between his higher order typed intentional logic and first order predicate logic made a crucial difference for the possibility of giving a compositional semantics based on a relatively conservative syntax for English, not having to depart to very abstract, far more abstract deep structures. Once Montague had been shown what could be done with the use of model theoretic techniques for compositional semantic interpretation, and with a higher order intentional logic, linguists and philosophers set about coming up with extensions and modifications of his ideas to fit natural language phenomena even better. Many aspects of his own analyses of the semantics of English have been superseded with major linguistically motivated innovations by Comp, Parsons, Heim, Kierkegaard, Kratzer, Ruth, Roberts, many others. But in overall impact, I would say that Montague's first works were as profound for semantics as Chomsky's were for syntax. Emin Bach summed up their cumulative innovations in his nice book, Informal Lectures on Formal Semantics. He summed them up like this: Chomsky's thesis was that English can be described as a formal system. Montague's thesis was that English can be described as an interpreted formal system. Truth conditions and entailment relations are basic. These are minimal data that have to be accounted for to reach observational adequacy in Chomsky's terms. That principle, inherited from the traditions of logic and model theory, is at the heart of Montague's semantics and is one of the defining principles of formal semantics. Creswell put this in the form of his most certain principle. We may not know what meanings are, but we do know that if two sentences are such that we can imagine a situation in which one of them is true and the other false, then they do not have the same meaning. And an amazing number of decisions about semantic analysis, both in general architecture and in particular instances, can be seen to follow from that principle, as Creswell and others showed. The advent of truth conditions and the tools of model theory made semantics an incomparably more powerful discipline than it had been before. It may be hard to realize how surprising and controversial an idea it was to linguists in the early 1970s that we should think about truth conditions and entailment relations rather than just ambiguity, semantic anomaly, and synonymy. So then joint work. This is the shortest part of the talk, but it's the longest period of the history. I'm not going to try to go up to the present by any means. Montague was doing his work on natural language at the height of the linguistic wars between generative and interpretive semantics, though Montague and the semanticists in linguistics had no awareness of each other in the late 60s. The earliest introduction of Montague's work to linguists came via some papers of mine starting in 1973 and of Rich Thomason, who published Montague's collected works with a long pedagogical introductory chapter in 74. Thomason and I argued that Montague's work might allow the syntactic structures generated to be relatively conservative, syntactically motivated, and autonomous syntax, with relatively minimal departure from direct generation of surface structure, while offering a principled way to address many of the semantic concerns that motivated some of the best work in generative semantics. Let me review, just for an example, an obstacle I faced when I started trying to put Montague grammar and transformational grammar together, whose solution is related to a leading idea that came into linguistics from philosophy and logic in this period, namely the Fregean idea that recursion, building up complex sentences from simpler ones, must be done on open sentences, sentences that have something equivalent to a variable in them, and not just closed sentences. So the obstacle was what to do about transformational deletion rules. In classical transformational grammar, 5a, Mary was eager to win, was derived from something like 5b, Mary was eager for Mary to win, by a transformation called equi-noun phrase deletion. But given the principle of compositionality, and given the way Montague grammar works by building up the meanings of constituents from meanings of their subconstituent, there's nothing that would correspond to deleting a piece of a meaning of some part you had already built up. So there's no place for deletion in Montague grammar. Recall the consequences of equinoun phrase deletion for a sentence like 6a, as I mentioned earlier. Everyone was eager to win. The presumed deep structure, everyone was eager for everyone to win, would clearly give the wrong meaning. The MGTG resolution suggested in my earliest papers were what we want as the underlying subject in the embedded sentence is not everyone, but some variable, a bindable variable. I followed Montague's line and bound it by lambda abstraction to give the complement a VP type. So I had the property of being an X such that X wins as the embedded part, an embedded VP. Some kept a sentence type for the infinitive, and had something like X win as the embedded part, and then you bind it at the same time you introduce the quantifier everyone. That solution is one illustration of the importance of the Fregean principle that wherever quantifiers may be involved, recursion has to be allowed to work on open sentences. We build up sentences with variables in them before we bring quantifiers in some sense. It was Montague's use of lambda abstraction as the active variable binding operator that unified variable binding in connection with quantification, relative clauses, interrogatives, and elsewhere. Lambda abstraction creates compositional names for functions. This is central to function argument-centered type theory. In retrospect, it was doing all recursion on closed sentences or kernel sentences that made transformational rules that involved, quote, identical NPs break down when quantifiers were discovered. In Chomskyan syntax, a corresponding change was eventually made, replacing that identical NP by the special null element pro, big pro, that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, interpreted as a bound variable. Other syntactic theories, including lexical functional grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, and modern categorical grammar, were developed later and were designed from the start not to run into those problems. And Polly Jacobson in her work has shown how you can capture these same things within a variable-free semantics. I've been talking in terms of variables, but you can do things with combinators. So see her work on that. The height of initial interaction on semantics between linguists and philosophers had passed by 1980, followed by the rise of cognitive science, including semantics, and then by a specialization of semantics inside of linguistics. We took it, with many individual scholars maintaining links of various kinds within and across the disciplines. By the middle of the 1980s, the recognition of formal semantics as part of the core curriculum in linguistics in many places was seen in the publication of textbooks and the growing number of departments with more than one semanticist. Formal semantics spread and became mainstream semantics in the US and Europe, in spite of Chomsky's skepticism. And MIT hired its first formal semantics, my student, Irena Heim, in 1989, and its second, Angelika Kratzer's student, Kai von Fintel, in 1994, and quickly became one of the leading programs in formal semantics as well as syntax. So our life was easier in semantics when they were resisting. Once they embraced it, now we're not always number one in semantics. There's a lot of great places in semantics. That's a good thing. By the early 1990s, formal semantics, no longer Montague grammar, though that was just about the time when Montague grammar made it into the Oxford English Dictionary, was a fully established field. And students were not conscious that the core fields hadn't always been phonology, syntax, semantics. By the late 90s, linguistics philosophy interaction was on the increase again, and more sophisticated than ever, thanks in part to Stalnecker's students at MIT of the Jason Stanley, Zoltan Sabo generation. And they were able to have seminars taught jointly by Irena Heim and Bob Stalnecker. With the work of Irena Heim, Angelika Kratzer, Gennaro Kierkia, and others, there was also much greater integration of formal semantics with Chomskyan syntax. I had tried to do that unsuccessfully in the 70s. They've done it much more successfully since the 90s. Now, much of the important work is at the syntax semantics interface. In the 21st century, formal semantics as a maturing discipline has a variety of approaches, differing in various ways, associated with different syntactic theories, different logical tools, etc., maintaining friendly and open-minded communication and shared goals. And the borders with informal semantics are not so sharp, which is good too. And like the older fields of phonology, morphology, and syntax, formal semantics and its younger sibling, formal pragmatics, have seen increasing efforts in fieldwork and typology. I would point to Susie Lima as the vanguard of that kind of work, in language acquisition and language processing, in the use of computational tools and applications to computational linguistics. The competition between theory-free deep learning approaches to computational linguistic goals and theory-rich symbolic approaches is thankfully beginning to give way to cooperative approaches exploiting their respective strength. Even Google has begun to hire formal semanticists. There's a lot of stuff Google can do that formal semanticists don't know how to do, but we're better at negation, it turns out. At least, well, maybe that's not true this week. They move so fast. This may reflect increasing appreciation of the differences between lexical semantics, which has always been a weak point of formal semantics, and compositional semantics, our strong point, and of the roles of context in interpretation. And I think that's my last substantive slide. So you'll have access to the slides somehow or other. The organizers will make sure. So there's a few references there and acknowledgements to many people who have helped me learn more about the history of the field, and to the special collections archivists at UCLA for great help in accessing the wonderful archive collection of the papers Montague left behind in perfect order. Okay, so I think my instruction is at this point, I believe I should stop sharing the screen. Okay, I stopped sharing the screen. Now I let the organizers take over. They can mute me if it's time to do that.
Right. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was great to hear you about our beloved field. So I'll start reading some of the questions people have sent. I apologize for not mentioning who is asking, because I'm getting the questions without the names of the authors, right? So one of the questions is a curiosity about what is the algorithm that Parsons found in Russell's 1905 work? That's the question.
Okay, so I can't just say it, but if you look at Russell's paper, and then you look at, say, the analysis of definite descriptions in Montague's proper treatment of quantification in natural language, you'll find that Montague has mapped directly from the plus king onto the generalized quantifier that expresses exactly what Russell believed it expressed. Montague gave a very Russellian analysis to definite descriptions, but he did it compositionally, because with his type theory, he could have a type for the determiner the, and a type for the common noun, and apply the determiner meaning as function to the common noun meaning as argument, and get as a result something which, if you reduce the whole sentence it's in to first order terms, is exactly what Russell wanted. And Parsons basically saw that what Russell gave there was a way to do that.
Thanks, Barbara. Next question is, I don't know whether I understand it, maybe you do. Why philosophers of the common language were rejected? By whom? I don't know. No.
But I'm not sure whether the question is why the ordinary language philosophers were rejecting the formal approach, or maybe it's why the formal language people were rejecting what the ordinary language philosophers were doing. I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure I feel completely competent to discuss that. I think it's, let me turn it into more personal terms. I had a confrontation with George Lakoff at some point when he had just given a lovely talk on how expressions which are literally used as locatives are sometimes used in broader domains to express domains of quantification and various other kinds of things. And it was similar to work I'd been doing in some type shifting stuff. But he gave his talk, and then at the end of his talk, he said, and that's why formal semantics is all wrong. Which to me was just a total non sequitur. So we continued arguing out in the hallway. And he said, well, you guys only work on you work on things like quantifiers and determiners and pronouns, the kinds of things that are very easy to think of in formal terms. You don't work on metaphor. You know, those are the hard and interesting problems. And if you want to see language as a window on the mind, you should be working on metaphor. And I argued with him that I thought it was really partly a temperament of what kind of problems people like to work on. That some of us who came from a background, like my undergraduate fields were mathematics and Russian and philosophy, you know, they end up finding a way to put logic and language together. Those working on those problems just suits me very well. And metaphors sort of scare me because it's too much like literature, which wasn't a field I was comfortable in. But I can appreciate that things like metaphor are immensely important, but it's really different. So it's like the formalists say, well, we want to work on things in a way that we can do it scientifically and really make testable claims about our analyses. And other people say, yeah, but the only things you've managed to work on are things that are not the deepest parts of language. That's my guess.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks. That is great. So next question is, what do you think of Chomsky's 2001's assumption that languages are all uniform regarding logical form? Does it mean that we shouldn't look for parameters in the semantics of languages?
That's a good, yeah. So it's not just Chomsky. There's a lot of people, there's a huge number of people who seem to believe that semantics is way more universal than syntax or morphology or phonology. And I don't know why. I think my own feeling is that semantics, well, compared to phonology, we know that all children have the ability to acquire any phonology, the phonology of any language. But we know that languages end up with different phonologies. And we know that all children have the whatever it takes to acquire the semantics of every language. Now, I don't believe that means they know the semantics in advance. I think we don't notice it as much, but I'm not the only one who has observed that there's such a thing as having a semantic accent, just like you have a phonological accent. Like, I can speak Russian somewhat well, but when it comes to aspect, the perfective and imperfective aspect, I just make mistakes all the time. When a Russian is speaking English, they will make mistakes with things that have to do with the uses of the articles. And because like when you're learning if you're learning the phonology of your language and your language doesn't have a certain distinction, you will have trouble with that distinction as a second language learner. And I think it's just the same for semantics. There are semantic distinctions that different languages make, and I think they can have different logical forms because I think there's different organizations of the structure as well as different particular aspectual features, etc. So I don't think we know enough yet. Some people will explore this question by assuming a universal logical form and seeing how well they can do. That reminds me of when right after Aspects of Theory of Syntax was written, there were a whole lot of dissertations on different languages done in the new Chomskyan framework. And they all had deep structures that looked exactly like the deep structure Chomsky had given for English, with some different transformations. Now, I don't think that's the way we think about the differences among the syntax of different languages anymore. And I think we may be still at a somewhat primitive state if we take somebody's idea of logical form and think that's what we'll see. We should graft every language onto that. But it's an open question, but such a big one that it will not be settled by any simple empirical means. It will just be settled as the theories develop farther.
Yeah, that was very interesting. So here's another one. What are your thoughts of the growing field of frame semantics based on Filmer 82, which rejects the idea that meaning can be studied as a separate entity from world knowledge?
So that's another huge and wonderful question. So here, yeah, I didn't say anything in this lecture about lexical semantics, which of course was one of Fillmore's central interests. And it's the area where that question arises acutely, because you don't need to have any world knowledge to understand the semantic principles for combining a relative clause with a head noun. You know, that's something in which the logical principles are very clear. The relative clause denotes a property, the head noun denotes a property, it's predicate conjunction that puts them together. The questions arise when you get down to the lexical items and what's the nature of their meanings. And you may have noticed in everything I talked about building up the meaning of the whole from the meaning of the parts, and that's what formal semantics has been all about. But I never said anything much about the meaning of the smallest parts themselves, and that's the lexical items. So Montague's strategy was divide and conquer, and it's a strategy that actually looks. I mean, a lot of people really think it was the right strategy theoretically as well. He treated all the ordinary lexical items as primitives. He would just figure out what semantic type they are and then introduce a logical constant of that type. So walk and run, for instance, are of the same semantic type. So whatever the difference is between the meaning of walk and the meaning of run was not something that Montague tried to study. He said that those issues are empirical, and and what I'm doing is really part of logic in a way. And Angelika Kratzer often says that the residual meaning of the lexical items after you've abstracted out things like their temporal properties and maybe a causative morpheme and other sort of separable pieces of verbal meaning, the residual property, that's not part of linguistics. Now, I find that also an extreme position. I would say, well, this is something I hope the next generation will figure out how to do, to take the good approaches to lexical semantics, which are of many different kinds, and Fillmore's work is brilliant, and the good approaches to compositional semantics, which my Russian colleague Elena Padicheva called what we were doing the semantics of syntax. You know, how you put together the meanings of the syntactic parts. So somebody's got to figure out how to look at the lexical meanings in a way that will be compatible with a good way of looking at compositional meanings. Because the Russian lexical semanticists were great on all kinds of things about lexical semantics, but kind of gave lip service to the fact that, well, in principle, we should be able to say how different lexical meanings combine together. But in practice, they had very little to say about that part. And we're sort of on the other end. That was why I was so happy to be working together with my Russian colleagues. But I think that's a big wide open field. That's also what I was alluding to in my very last point on the slide about the different approaches to computational linguistics, some of which seem to be able to get a lot of mileage looking at lexical semantics in these statistical terms, just looking at what other expressions a given word occurs with in natural speech, something that many people will just dismiss as having nothing to do with meaning. But I think similarity in distribution and similarity in meaning have something to do with each other. And it may be just a placeholder for something else we might find. But if we could find ways to put those things together and have compositional vector semantics, or compositional frame semantics. You know, that I think those would be goals to work toward.
Thank you. That's very much you, Barbara.
I guess, yeah, I think, yes, I gotta say, one thing I loved in your introduction was you picked up on the part that I think I got from my mother. Whenever any two of her friends were at odds with each other, she couldn't rest until she got them reconciled. Yeah. And I think, you know, when I had my education with Chomsky, and then at UCLA discovered Montague, and oh, these are both great, but how do we put them together? And I couldn't rest until I could find at least a meaning of some way.
But it's such a great trait, I think. So, okay, next question. What's your view on the use of corpus linguistics on the studies of semantics and pragmatics?
Corpus linguistics. Well, just for fun, I just was the director of an undergraduate honors thesis that was looking at some corpus semantics and looking at what do they call it? Emotion tracking. I'm not saying the word quite right, but the way the computational linguists are learning to figure out, take all these reviews and you can predict which of those go with positive ratings and which go with negative. Sentiment analysis. That's what I'm trying to say.
What?
Sentiment analysis. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable attitude towards such and such? You can tell from the way somebody writes about something about their emotional or evaluative attitude toward it. So these are all great tools for examining things. And from working with this student, she started out, she was going to do everything. Well, she had to pare down the project and make it a little more manageable, but it really led us to interesting questions. Chris Potts has done interesting work in combining formal semantics and computational work on trying to dig into corpora and figure out how to get content out of corpora. This is beyond my time frame. I'm old now, and I just watch in awe at some of these things the young people are doing.
Okay, so now we go back to type shifting.
That's closer to me.
Do type shifts, which were introduced in your paper in '86, motivate grammatical structures in overt positions? I'm not sure I understand it, but
I almost do. I'm not sure. I mean, let me, since that we just have what we have, let me just play with that topic and go with it. So some very interesting work by, let me remember, Ken Hale together with Maria Bittner. We're looking at Ken Hale's work on Walbury and Maria Bittner's work on Polish, and looking at how adding some principles about type shifting could help explain a puzzle that Ken Hale had always had in Walbury, that the word that meant many, that he always thought meant many in Walbury, sometimes meant all, which is not possible for the word for many in English or Portuguese or Polish. And it turned out that Walbury and all the languages we know differ from each other with respect to whether there is a category. I may not get this right out of my head, whether there's a separate category for determiners. And if there's no, the principle they ended up articulating was, if a language does not have any basic elements for a given item in a given category, for a given type to correspond to a given category, then it's never going to shift any elements into that semantic type. As a language will have an inventory of elements that are in semantic types, and you can shift other elements into those types. But if the initial inventory doesn't have, say, determiner in the type that would take to make a generalized quantifier, it's not going to shift anything into a determiner type. So this relates to like there's debates about what to do with a language like Russian that has no overt articles. Do you posit a zero article, or do you just type shift? Do you just have some of the kinds of type shifts I suggested, like a definiteness type shift, shifting a common noun phrase into the type of a full DP with a definite meaning? And that's a competing approach to positing null determiners. And I think the jury is still out. There are some linguists who argue there's always, all languages have a determiner, and there's always, the DP always has a D. And if it looks like there's no determiners, then there are null ones. And the other approach says, well, no, I mean, you'd have to convince me that they should all be alike in that way if we could do the same thing by type shifting. And as usual, it's going to be settled by where you can find the most explanatory constraints and principles that will not overgenerate the typological possibilities.
Right. Thank you. Next. In the history of contemporary semantics, what is the role, if any, of Grice? That's interesting. Grice?
Oh, yeah. So I'm glad that question came up, because I put pragmatics in the title of this talk. And then I realized as I was preparing it that, oh, it was already in danger of being too long. And I said almost nothing about pragmatics. So when anybody who's ever had an introductory formal semantics course from me always knows that there's a full lecture on Grice in there. Because what we learned from Grice was, do not try to put into your semantics things that can be predicted as additions to meaning that come from the use of the sentence you chose to use in the context you're using it in. So at the very least, Grice is really, he was really important in showing that, for instance, you don't have to posit a separate exclusive or, even though we know we interpret lots of disjunctive sentences as exclusive rather than inclusive, because you can generally derive that by Gricean cooperative principles just from your assumptions about if the person used the or, then they don't know that either the one or the other is true. So yeah, I'm not answering that very precisely, but so Grice was really important for getting us to see the differences between the parts of meaning that are part of the assertion when you say a sentence, and the parts of meaning that should be better considered implicatures. And that field of study has really taken off in the last couple of decades with more fine-grained distinctions and interesting debates started by people like Gennaro Chierchia about how some of that happens not just at the level of a complete big sentence, but even in smaller subsentential clauses at the level of the clause. We go through a lot of implicature reasoning. Uli Sauerland has done a lot of work of that sort. And there's all kinds of exciting stuff going on.
Thanks again, Barbara. Next. Minimalist syntax has been focusing on the interfaces. Binding, for instance, is focusing on its syntax pragmatics. Do you think we are in the Garden of Eden time again? We hope so. Yeah. We would like that.
Yeah. It may be. I've got to confess, I didn't keep following syntax nearly as closely as I was following semantics. So I never became completely at home in minimalist syntax, even though it's all around me in my department. But my impression is that it's much closer to the Montegovian idea of you put together the smaller pieces and you interpret as you build. And that's I mean, that's so that should make it a lot easier to have. I mean, the way Emmon Bach used to talk about a whole grammar with phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics. Think of it as a big n-tuple, and you build up the n-tuple of the whole thing from the n-tuples of the parts, building up phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, all in parallel as you construct a sentence from its littlest pieces. That would be some kind of Garden of Eden if it worked. Of course, there are all these mismatches you have to then worry about, but because the phonology doesn't always look like the morphology.
Right, thank you again. Yeah, now here's a question about the future.
Uh-oh.
Where are we heading? What I mean, as doing the history of formal semantics, somehow you probably think of it, or maybe you see a pattern or something. So
I just have to confess, I have never been good at the big picture. And my book isn't going to try to go up into now. I mean, so I'm really looking back at how it began, and the major interactions that helped make formal semantics what it became, and now I feel like it has exploded in so many directions that, I mean, all cooperative, but many different topics being worked on. I mean, now there are conferences on the semantics and pragmatics of X, you know, for every kind of phenomenon you can think of. It can have a whole conference. So I am not the one. I mean, there's others that might make prognoses about the future, but I don't. I mean, I'll make another confession. When I was a graduate student, I was just having fun because I had discovered there is a field where you can be interested in languages and math and kind of put them together. And I just was doing everything because it was fun. But somewhere along in my training, I was taught that some things count as interesting and other things don't count as interesting, kind of with a capital I. And you have to learn that a little bit if you're going to write grant proposals, because you have to make your work sound important. But that was all stuff I kind of learned to sort of do, you know, when I had to write a grant proposal or something. And maybe that's maybe similar to never having a really big picture. I've just always been having fun, and I still am.
Right. Okay. One question here is, to what extent can we say compositional semantic interpretation is influenced by syntax?
It's absolutely built on syntax. I mean, this is this is the part where Chomsky was even agreeing. You know, he was saying one of the things syntax is responsible for is providing a basis for a good semantics. And compositionality is absolutely consistent with autonomous syntax, because the semantic interpretation is how you get the meaning of the whole from the meaning of the parts. And it's syntax that tells you what the parts are. And the only part where a semanticist like me would say syntax is not autonomous has to do with evaluating whether you've got a good syntax or not. And that's why I'm so happy that so many people are working on syntax semantic interface, where you have to keep thinking about both together, because I would never try to evaluate semantics without looking at whether the syntax it presupposes is a reasonable one, and I wouldn't evaluate some syntax without seeing whether the composition, the structure it gives you for building your compositional semantics is reasonable. So they absolutely go together. That's the idea of the homomorphism between the two algebras, or many other ways to think of it. But compositional semantics absolutely needs some syntax to build on.
Okay, Barbara, thank you so much. I have one question. The last one. Sure. It's just a curiosity. It is my impression, maybe you don't agree, but there is a lot of stress going on now on the empirical science, like, you know, psycholinguistics, corpus linguistics, or even what statistics, and so, and then a lot of money going on to that field. That's, you know, just doing theories, not being so valued anymore. So I don't think, you know, giving money to empirical sciences is bad or good, but I have that impression that we are now in a phase that stresses empiricism rather than theory. So I'd like to ask your opinion on that.
I think that the UMass Linguistics Department, I think, is a beautiful example of how it's not either or, it's both. Because when we have, in the last years, especially since I've retired, we've hired several people who do computational linguistics, several who do experimental linguistics of one kind and another, but always it's been people who are interested in the interaction of empirical studies and theory. So there's no anti-theory people in our department, but there's lots and lots of empirical work. And I think it's like, can you remember, are you old enough to remember back at the time when field linguists and theoreticians didn't talk to each other? You know, before Ken Hale, when the field linguists thought it's immoral to be working on theory when there's all these languages that haven't been described yet. And the theoreticians were saying, yeah, but what kind of descriptions are they giving if they don't have any theory to work with? And there was just no meeting of the minds. And nobody thinks that way anymore, right? I mean, now the work on all the indigenous languages is being done by people who really have interesting questions to ask, but at the same time feel responsible to describe the languages in a way useful for the speakers of those languages. And all, I mean, in principle, of course, in principle, every empirical method can give us some new data to enrich our theories. And theories and good theories help enrich the kinds of questions that are asked. I think I saw a little of this even when I was a graduate student. My two syntax professors were Ed Klima and Noam Chomsky. And both of them, when in my first year, were working on determiners. And I was going to both classes and seeing, you know, some similarities, but gradually dawned on me over time that there was a big difference in their sort of motivations in a way. Klima was really interested in the English language and in puzzles about the English language and how it worked. And he was delighted to have found this transformational theory to help him have better ways of answering the puzzles he was interested in. Chomsky, I realized, sort of, it's almost as if having natural language data was a necessary evil, but you had to have some data to test your theories in. What he was interested in was the theory and having a beautiful theory. And the natural language stuff was, I learned what was interesting to him, a fact of natural language, interesting insofar as it might provide a critical experiment or something to help choose between two theoretical issues. And they were, I think they were very different in their motivations, but very compatible in their work. And I think that's the way it is now. And theory and empirical data should go together.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Barbara. That was the last question. It was great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
We thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the people who are translating this. It's the travel points, the people who are translating it. Thank Abralin for putting all this together. And thank you so much. It was great to see you.
It was great to see you. And I thank you all. Thank you so much.